The whispers had followed Lady Rosalind Hartwell through every ballroom in London for exactly 5 years, 2 months and 17 days. Not that she counted anymore. Not that the precise number of mornings she had woken to the weight of shame pressing against her chest like a stone mattered in the grand scheme of a ruined life. But on this particular autumn evening in 1826, as she stood before the full-length mirror in her modest chamber at Hartwell House, watching her lady's maid arrange the deep sapphire silk of her gown, Rosalind Hartwell found herself counting again, counting the years, counting the impossibility of hope. "You look beautiful, my lady," her maid, Betsy, whispered, her kind eyes meeting Rosalind's in the mirror's silvered surface. "Any gentleman would be honored." Rosalind offered a smile that had become second nature over the long years of exile. A smile that acknowledged kindness without believing it. A smile that had learned to live in the space between gratitude and despair. "Thank you, Betsy," she replied, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has spoken the same reassurances so many times they have worn smooth as river stones. "Though we both know no gentleman has been honored to dance with me in quite some time." The reflection staring back at her showed a woman of 22 who carried herself with the careful dignity of someone much older. Her auburn hair, rich as autumn leaves touched by fire, had been arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the classical lines of her face. Green eyes that had once sparkled with youthful joy now held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. The gown she wore was beautiful but deliberately modest, designed to attract neither attention nor censure, to exist in that careful middle ground where the disgraced learned to make their homes. She had grown beautiful in her exile, she knew. Not despite the scandal, but because of it. Pain had carved away everything soft and uncertain, leaving behind something harder and more luminous. Like a gemstone cut by a master's hand, each facet reflecting light earned through trials. But beauty, as Rosalind had learned, meant nothing when wrapped in shame. The sound of footsteps in the corridor pulled her from her thoughts, and moments later, her younger sister burst through the door with all the enthusiasm of someone who had never known what it meant to be unwelcome in the world. "Rosalind," Cordelia exclaimed, her 19-year-old face bright with excitement. "You're not backing out. I can see it in your eyes. You're thinking of excuses." "I'm doing no such thing," Rosalind protested, though the truth sat between them like a third presence in the room. She had been calculating how long propriety demanded they stay at the Remington ball before she could plead a headache and escape back to the safety of invisibility. Cordelia moved to stand beside her sister, and the contrast between them was striking. Where Rosalind had learned to dim her light, Cordelia burned bright. Where Rosalind had been taught by circumstance to withdraw, Cordelia remained determinedly present. The scandal that had destroyed one sister had perversely made the other fierce. "You've been hiding for 5 years," Cordelia said softly, taking Rosalind's hand in hers. "And I have stood beside you every moment, and I would stand beside you for 50 more if needed. But Roz, you cannot let them win. You are the most honorable person I know. You saved that girl. You did nothing wrong." The memory rose unbidden as it always did, sharp as broken glass, bright as blood. A summer evening in 1821. The Blackwood country estate where London's finest had gathered for a month-long house party. Rosalind, only 17, had slipped into the gardens, seeking respite from the oppressive heat of the ballroom. The moon had been full that night, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. She could still hear the sounds that had drawn her deeper into the maze of hedges. A woman's muffled cry, the low, threatening murmur of a man's voice. And when she had rounded the corner, she had found him. Lord Philip Ravenscroft, his hands brutal on the young maid Maris, pinning her against the stone wall of the folly while she struggled and wept. Rosalind had not hesitated. She had seized a fallen branch and struck Ravenscroft across the shoulders, crying out for help. The maid had fled. And in the chaos of her escape, in the tangle of Rosalind trying to fight off a man twice her size, other guests had arrived to find what appeared to be a compromising embrace. Ravenscroft, with the quick cunning of a predator, had immediately claimed that Rosalind had approached him inappropriately, that she had lured him to the garden with promises, that he, a gentleman, had been trying to politely extricate himself when they were discovered. And Maris, terrified of losing her position of being cast into the streets without reference or protection, had said nothing at all. Society had been eager to believe the worst. A beautiful young girl with perhaps too much spirit caught in a scandal with a wealthy lord. It was the kind of story that fed the gossip machines of London for months. The fact that Rosalind swore her innocence only made it more delicious. The fallen woman who refused to admit her fall. Her father, weak-willed and conscious of his own precarious social position, had essentially exiled her from society. No formal cuts, but a quiet withdrawal from invitations. A slow fading from the world of ballrooms and morning calls and all the small rituals that made up a young lady's life. And Rosalind had borne it with the kind of grace that only made the whispers worse. Because surely, they said, if she were truly innocent, she would rage and protest. Her very dignity became proof of guilt. "I tried to save her," Rosalind whispered, now meeting her sister's eyes in the mirror. "And I destroyed myself." "No," Cordelia said fiercely. "You saved her. The fact that society chose to punish you for it says everything about them and nothing about you. And tonight you are going to that ball. You are going to hold your head high, and you are going to show them that their judgment has not broken you." Rosalind turned to embrace her sister, feeling the fierce love that had sustained her through the darkest hours. Cordelia had been only 14 when the scandal broke. She could have distanced herself, could have preserved her own prospects by treating her ruined sister with polite coldness. Instead, she had remained defiantly loyal, refusing every suitor who dared suggest she should be ashamed of her association with the scandalous Lady Rosalind. "What would I do without you?" Rosalind murmured against her sister's hair. "You'll never have to find out," Cordelia promised. "Now come. The carriage is waiting, and I have it on good authority that the Remington Ball will be the event of the season. Half the peerage will be there, including, though neither sister knew it yet, a duke who had been waiting 5 years, 2 months, and 17 days for exactly this moment. Duke Lucian Ashcroft stood in the shadows of his private study, watching the last rays of the setting sun paint the London sky in shades of amber and rose. His butler Edmund, a man who had served the Ashcroft family for 3 generations and kept secrets that would destroy empires, waited patiently by the door. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace," Edmund said quietly. "Though I must note that the Remington Ball begins at 8. You will be arriving fashionably late." "I cannot arrive earlier," Lucian replied, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone who has spoken the same excuse for over a century. "You know why." Edmund inclined his head in acknowledgement. He did know. He knew everything about the Duke of Ashcroft that society could never suspect. He knew that the man standing before him, appearing to be in the prime of life at 34, had in fact been born in 1646. He knew that the illness that kept the Duke confined to his estates during daylight hours was no illness at all. He knew that the Ashcroft cellars held not just wine, but vessels of carefully preserved blood, acquired through means both legal and shadowed. He knew his master was a vampire. "The lady will be there tonight," Edmund said, not quite a question. "Lady Rosalind Hartwell," Lucian confirmed, turning from the window now that the dangerous light had faded to manageable dusk. "She and her sister received invitations. My sources confirm they plan to attend." "You've been watching her for 5 years, Your Grace." "I have been ensuring her safety," Lucian corrected, though the distinction was perhaps thinner than he cared to admit. "She was wrong that night. I saw what happened." Edmund's eyebrow rose fractionally. "You were at the Blackwood estate that summer." "I was nearby, hunting." Lucian's jaw tightened at the memory. He had been feeding in the woods beyond the estate when he heard the commotion in the gardens. By the time he had arrived, careful to keep to the shadows, he had witnessed the entire scene. The assault, Rosalind's brave intervention, the lies that followed. He had wanted to intervene, to use his considerable power and influence to defend her. But he had learned long ago that such interventions came with prices he could not ask others to pay. The last woman he had tried to save, the last woman he had allowed himself to care for, had discovered his true nature and died fleeing from him in terror. So he had watched and waited and told himself he was protecting her by keeping his distance, and tried not to notice how the memory of her courage haunted him through the long, solitary years. "And now you plan to court her publicly," Edmund said. "Forgive my impertinence, Your Grace, but have you considered the complications your nature makes certain, accommodations necessary, and the lady has already suffered enough scandal." Lucian moved to the mirror, though his reflection showed nothing but an empty room and a servant standing alone. Another reminder of what he was, what he could never be. "I have considered everything," he said quietly, "including the strong possibility that this is the most selfish thing I have done in nearly 2 centuries. But Edmund, I am so tired of existing in perpetual twilight. She makes me want to live again, even if I can only do so in stolen moments between dusk and dawn." Edmund's expression softened with something that might have been pity, though he would never have insulted his master by naming it as such. "Then I wish you joy, Your Grace, and I pray the lady has a strong constitution and an open mind. I should also warn you," Lucian added, "that my mother arrives in London next week. She has heard rumors of my interest in Lady Rosalind and wishes to assess the situation. Edmund's lips twitched. The Dowager Duchess does enjoy her assessments. Shall I prepare the guest chambers in the east wing? The ones with the heavy drapes, yes. Lucian turned toward the door, adjusting his cravat with fingers that did not tremble, though perhaps they should have. Tonight he would step out of the shadows he had inhabited for 5 years. Tonight he would make his interest known. Tonight he would risk everything he had protected for so long for the sake of a woman he had no right to want. But when a man has lived as long as Lucian Ashcroft, when he has endured isolation that would drive mortal men mad, when he has watched the world change and age while he remains frozen in an eternal twilight, the prospect of genuine connection becomes worth any risk. Even if that connection could only ever be fleeting, even if it was doomed from the start. The carriage ride through London's evening streets gave him time to review his strategy. He would arrive late when the ball was in full swing. He would observe Lady Rosalind from a distance, first as he had been doing for years. And then when the moment was right, he would approach. He would ask for a dance, and he would begin the careful, dangerous process of inserting himself into her life. He did not allow himself to think beyond that, did not let himself imagine what might happen when she inevitably discovered what he was. The pattern was always the same: discovery, horror, flight, loss. But perhaps, whispered a treacherous voice in the back of his mind, perhaps she would be different. She had already proven herself capable of extraordinary courage. Perhaps she could face one more impossible truth. The Remington mansion blazed with light as his carriage drew up to the entrance. He could hear the music spilling out into the night, could smell the mingled scents of perfume and candle wax, and the thousand small emanations of humanity gathered in celebration. Once such gatherings had tortured him with their reminder of everything he had lost. Now he had learned to move through them like a ghost present, but not truly part of the living warmth around him. Tonight he thought stepping down from the carriage tonight might be different. Tonight he might dare to reach for something more than endless night. The Remington ballroom was ablaze with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers until the entire space seemed to shimmer like something from a fever dream. Rosalind stood near the wall in the position she had occupied at every society event she had attended in the past 5 years. Not quite hidden, but certainly not visible. A ghost at the feast. Cordelia had been claimed immediately for the first dance by young Lord Whitmore, a kind-faced gentleman who had the good sense to value loyalty over gossip. They whirled past in a blur of blue silk and dark evening wear, and Cordelia caught Rosalind's eye with an encouraging smile. Rosalind smiled back, genuinely pleased to see her sister happy. If nothing else good came from this evening, at least Cordelia could enjoy herself without worry. That was worth the discomfort of being here, of feeling the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that followed her like a shadow. She had been standing there for perhaps 20 minutes watching the dancers with the detached observation of someone who had learned to find entertainment in studying human nature rather than participating in it when she became aware of being watched. The sensation was distinct, undeniable. Like a touch against the back of her neck or a change in the temperature of the air around her, she had felt it before actually over the past several years. Moments when she could have sworn someone's gaze was fixed upon her with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. But whenever she looked around, she found no one staring. Just the usual faces, the usual indifference mixed with occasional disdain. Tonight, though, when she turned her head, slightly scanning the crowd with practiced casualness, she found the source. He stood near the refreshment table, tall and commanding, in impeccably tailored evening wear of midnight blue that made his dark hair seem almost black in the candlelight. He was not looking at the other gentlemen he stood with, though they were engaged in animated conversation. He was looking at her. Duke Lucian Ashcroft. The name came to her immediately, though she had never been formally introduced. Everyone knew of the Duke of Ashcroft, wealthy beyond measure, titled beyond reproach, and mysterious in a way that made him the subject of endless speculation among the ton. He rarely appeared in society, and when he did, it was always at evening events. Never morning calls, never afternoon garden parties, never anything that required him to be abroad during daylight hours. Some said he had a terrible illness that made him sensitive to light. Others whispered about melancholy, about a broken heart that kept him sequestered in his vast estates. Still others suggested something darker, though these whispers were quickly hushed by those who knew better than to gossip about a duke. He was by all accounts the most eligible bachelor in England, and he was staring at Rosalind with an intensity that made her heart begin to race for reasons she could not name. She should look away. It was improper to hold a gentleman's gaze, especially across a crowded ballroom, especially when that gentleman was so far above her station that any interaction would only fuel fresh gossip. She should lower her eyes, turn her attention back to the dancers, fade back into the wallpaper where ruined women belonged. But she did not look away. There was something in his eyes even at this distance. Something that was not pity, not curiosity, not the salacious interest of a man who believed her reputation and thought her easy prey. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition. As if he knew her, though they had never spoken. As if he saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one had in long years. The moment stretched between them taut as a violin string. Around them the ball continued its glittering spin. Couples danced, gossips whispered, matrons calculated. But in that small pocket of awareness between Duke Lucian Ashcroft and Lady Rosalind Hartwell, time seemed to slow and thicken like honey. And then he moved, not quickly, not with the eager stride of a man rushing to claim a prize, but with deliberate purpose, crossing the ballroom floor with the kind of confidence that came from never having questioned one's welcome anywhere. People stepped aside without seeming to notice they were doing so. Conversations paused and resumed, and all the while his gray eyes never left hers. Rosalind felt frozen in place like a deer that has caught the scent of a predator and knows that flight is futile. Her pulse hammered in her throat. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her sapphire skirt, trembled. This was not happening. This could not be happening. Duke Lucian Ashcroft was not walking toward her with clear intent. He would pass by. He would veer off at the last moment to speak with someone more appropriate. Someone whose name was not synonymous with scandal. But he did not pass by. He stopped directly before her, and up close the effect of him was almost overwhelming. He was handsome, yes, in the way that all aristocrats seem to be, with good bones and better breeding. But there was something else. Something in the set of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes, the way he held himself with the coiled stillness of someone who has learned perfect control. He looked like a man who carried secrets, who understood rejection, who might impossibly understand her. Lady Rosalind Hartwell, he said, and his voice was everything she had not expected. Deep and rich, yes, but also gentle, respectful. He offered a bow that was far deeper than her tarnished reputation warranted, than propriety required. Would you do me the honor of dancing the next set with me? The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, and the ripples spread outward across the ballroom in waves of shocked silence. Nearby conversations stuttered and stopped. Heads turned, eyes widened, because everyone knew that the Duke of Ashcroft was not a man given to charitable gestures or social experiments. When he chose a partner, it was with deliberate intent and careful consideration. And he had chosen the scandalous Lady Rosalind. She should refuse. Every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson learned through years of exile screamed at her to decline politely, to save him from this mistake, to protect both of them from the gossip that would surely follow. But when she looked into his steady gray eyes, seeing neither pity nor calculation, nor any of the things she had learned to expect from men who approached her, she found her voice saying something entirely different. "Your Grace," she whispered, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You will regret choosing me. My reputation will only bring you trouble." It was both warning and plea, a last chance for him to reconsider, to step back before this moment became irrevocable. But Duke Lucian Ashcroft's smile was warm and utterly confident as he extended his hand to her. His voice when he spoke carried a conviction that seemed to resonate in the very air around them. "My only regret, Lady Rosalind, is that I waited so long to make your acquaintance." The words hung between them, a promise and a challenge, and perhaps something that might become more. Rosalind stared at his outstretched hand, at the elegant fingers that could change everything with a single touch. This was the moment, the precipice. She could step back into safety, into the familiar landscape of shame and isolation. Or she could step forward into uncertainty, into possibility, into the terrifying prospect of hope. The orchestra was beginning the opening notes of a waltz. Around them, couples were moving toward the dance floor, and Duke Lucian Ashcroft was waiting, patient and certain for her decision. Rosalind took a breath that felt like the first breath after drowning, and she placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and he led her onto the dance floor, as if she were a duchess rather than a disgraced lady no one had dared touch in 5 years. The other dancers shifted to make room for them, and Rosalind was acutely aware of every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them with varying degrees of shock, curiosity, and disapproval. But then Lucian's hand settled at her waist, and his other hand clasped hers, and the music swelled, and they began to move. Rosalind had not danced in over 2 years, having been effectively excluded from such intimate social rituals by the weight of her scandal. She half expected to stumble, to make a fool of herself and prove everyone right about her unworthiness. But Lucian guided her with such skill and certainty that she found herself moving as if she had been born to dance, as if this right here was exactly where she belonged. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it beneath the soaring music. "Though I suspect you do everything beautifully." The compliment should have felt false calculated, but there was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that suggested genuine admiration rather than empty flattery. "You are very kind, Your Grace," she managed, though her heart was beating so hard she was certain he must feel it through her gown. "Though I fear I am terribly out of practice." "No one would know it," he assured her, guiding her through a turn with effortless grace. "You move as though you were born for this." They danced in silence for a few measures, and Rosalind became aware of details she could not quite explain. The way his hand at her waist seemed almost cool, even through the fabric of her gown. The way he moved with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural, as if he could anticipate the music before it played. The way his eyes this close seemed to hold depths that no 34-year-old man should possess. "May I ask you something, Lady Rosalind?" he said quietly. "Of course, Your Grace." "Do you believe in second chances?" The question was so unexpected that she nearly missed a step. His hand tightened fractionally at her waist, steadying her, and she found herself staring up into his face with something close to wonder. "I am not certain society believes in second chances, Your Grace," she replied carefully. "At least not for women." "I did not ask about society," Lucian said, and there was something fierce in his voice now. "I asked about you. Do you, Rosalind Hartwell, believe that people can be more than their worst moments? That they can be more than what others say about them?" Her throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "I have to believe it," she whispered, "or else there is no hope for me at all." "Then we are agreed," he said softly, "because I have learned that the world's judgment means nothing compared to the truth of who we are when no one is watching." The phrasing was odd, that sense of having learned rather than simply believed. But Rosalind found she did not care about the strangeness. She cared only about the feeling blooming in her chest like a flower that had forgotten how to grow. Something warm and fragile and terrifyingly precious. Hope. As the waltz drew to a close, Lucian did something that made her heart stutter in her chest. Instead of releasing her immediately as propriety dictated, he kept her hand in his for a moment longer. And in that moment, as they stood still, while the music faded and other couples began to disperse, his thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it might have been accidental. Except Rosalind's glove had a small tear near the knuckle, one she had not had time to mend, and his thumb, which should have been warm and alive, touched bare skin. The sensation that raced through her at that contact was something she had not expected. Cool, like touching marble that had been kept in the shadow, like the kiss of winter wind against summer skin. She gasped, a small sound that she tried to disguise as breathlessness from the dance. But Lucian's eyes met hers with sudden intensity, and she saw something flash across his face. Awareness, concern, and underneath it all, something that might have been fear. He released her hand immediately, stepping back with a bow that restored proper distance between them. "Thank you for the dance, Lady Rosalind," he said, his voice carefully neutral now, as if that strange moment of connection had never happened. "It was everything I hoped it would be." "The pleasure was mine, Your Grace," she replied automatically, though her mind was racing. What had she felt? What did it mean? And why did he look at her now as if he had just made a terrible mistake? But before she could pursue the thought, they were surrounded by curious onlookers, by whispered conversations that rose like a tide around them. Lady Pemberton was approaching, with barely concealed shock on her face. Lord Whitmore had paused mid-conversation to stare. And across the room, Cordelia was watching with her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright with tears of joy. The Duke of Ashcroft had danced with the scandalous Lady Rosalind, and nothing in London society would ever be quite the same. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of sensation and confusion. True to his word, Lucian did not abandon her after their dance. He remained near her, engaging her in conversation about literature and art and philosophy, treating her as if she were any other lady of good standing. And gradually and possibly other members of society began to follow his lead. Lord Pemberton, who had not spoken to her in 3 years, offered a polite bow and inquired after her health. Lady Thornton, notorious for her sharp tongue and sharper judgments, actually smiled at her across the room. And young Lord Whitmore, emboldened perhaps by the Duke's example, asked her to dance the quadrille. It was as if Lucian's attention had cast a protective spell around her, transforming her in the eyes of society from pariah to person once again. Rosalind moved through it all in a state of suspended disbelief, waiting for the dream to shatter, for reality to reassert itself with its familiar cruelty. But the dream held. When the evening finally drew to a close and Rosalind and Cordelia made their way to their carriage, Lucian appeared one last time to hand them in himself, a courtesy usually reserved for ladies of the highest standing. Lady Rosalind, he said, bowing over her hand with the same careful formality he had shown all evening. Lady Cordelia, I hope you both enjoyed the evening. We did, Your Grace, Cordelia replied before Rosalind could gather her scattered wits. Very much indeed. I am glad, Lucian said, but his eyes were on Rosalind. Lady Rosalind, I wonder if I might have your permission to call upon you tomorrow afternoon. The request sent another shock through the assembled onlookers, who had been loitering nearby hoping to witness one more moment of scandal or romance. A duke requesting permission to call was tantamount to a declaration of serious interest. It meant courtship. It meant intention. It meant everything Rosalind had thought forever lost to her. Your Grace, she began, because she had to warn him one more time, had to give him one more chance to reconsider. I fear that association with me will only bring you difficulty. My reputation is based on lies and misunderstanding, Lucian interrupted gently but firmly. And I am far more interested in who you are now than in what others have said about your past. May I call Lady Rosalind? She should say no, should protect him from the gossip that would surely intensify if he continued to show her favor, should retreat back into the safety of invisibility before she began to hope for things that could never be. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that gave her courage, understanding, acceptance, and underneath it all, a loneliness that seemed to echo her own. Yes, Your Grace, she heard herself say. You may call. His smile was radiant, transforming his austere features into something almost beautiful. Then I shall see you tomorrow. Good night, Lady Rosalind. Dream well. The carriage pulled away, leaving him standing in the torchlight outside the Remington mansion. And Rosalind watched through the window as his figure receded into the night, wondering if she had just made the wisest or the most foolish decision of her life. He's in love with you, Cordelia breathed beside her, clutching her hand with barely suppressed excitement. Did you see how he looked at you? Did you hear how he spoke, Rosalind? I think the Duke of Ashcroft is genuinely, truly in love with you. Don't be absurd, Rosalind murmured, but her heart was racing and her mind kept returning to that moment when their skin had touched, to the strange coolness of his hand, to the flash of something almost like fear in his eyes. What was she missing? What secret lay beneath his careful courtesy and obvious interest? They arrived home to find a single letter waiting for Rosalind on the hall table. No name, no seal, just her name written in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. She opened it with trembling fingers, Cordelia reading over her shoulder. The message was brief, chilling in its simplicity. Lady Rosalind, I write to warn you of a danger you cannot yet perceive. The Duke of Ashcroft is not what he seems. There is a darkness in him that goes beyond mere scandal or social impropriety. For your own safety, for the sake of your soul, I beg you to refuse his attentions. He has already destroyed one woman who made the mistake of loving him. Do not become the second. A friend. Rosalind's hands shook as she lowered the letter. Cordelia's face had gone pale. It's just gossip, her sister said, but she sounded uncertain. Someone jealous of the attention he showed you. Someone trying to frighten you away. Perhaps, Rosalind agreed quietly. But as she climbed the stairs to her chamber that night, as she prepared for bed and lay staring at the ceiling, while the candle burned low, she could not stop thinking about that moment of contact, about the unnatural coolness of his skin, about the way he had looked at her with such longing and such fear, about the way he had spoken of having learned certain truths as if he had lived long enough to accumulate wisdom beyond his apparent years. What secrets did Duke Lucian Ashcroft carry? And was she brave enough, foolish enough, desperate enough to discover them? Outside her window, the moon rose full and cold over London. And somewhere in the night, in a mansion far grander than hers, a man, who was not quite a man, stood at his own window and wondered if he had just made the greatest mistake of his very, very long life. Or perhaps whispered the hope he had thought long dead. Perhaps he had finally, after nearly 2 centuries of exile, taken the first step toward redemption. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow he would call upon Lady Rosalind Hartwell and begin the careful, dangerous dance of courtship. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, for this one fragile moment, both the ruined lady and the immortal Duke allowed themselves to hope that perhaps against all odds and reason, they might find in each other the one thing that had eluded them both, a second chance at living. The morning sun poured through Rosalind's chamber window, with a brightness that felt almost accusatory, as if the light itself were demanding answers to questions she had not yet learned to ask. She sat at her writing desk, the anonymous letter spread before her like a tarot card promising dark futures, and tried to make sense of the impossible evening that had preceded this impossibly ordinary dawn. The Duke of Ashcroft had danced with her, had defended her, had requested permission to call, and someone somewhere thought this development dangerous enough to warrant a warning delivered under cover of night. There is a darkness in him that goes beyond mere scandal or social impropriety. Rosalind traced the words with one finger, feeling the slight indentation the pen had made in the heavy paper. Expensive stationery, educated handwriting. This was no servant's gossip or jealous rival's spite. This was someone of position, someone who knew something, or thought they did. "You're brooding," Cordelia announced, sweeping into the room with the determined cheerfulness of someone who had decided that happiness was a choice and scandal be damned. "I can see it in the set of your shoulders. You're letting that ridiculous letter poison what should be the happiest morning of your life." "The happiest morning of my life," Rosalind repeated softly. "Delia, I danced with a duke, one dance. That hardly constitutes—" "He's calling this afternoon," Cordelia interrupted, settling onto the bed with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering excellent news. "A footman brought his card an hour ago while you were still sleeping. 4 o'clock. He specifically requested tea in the garden." Rosalind's heart performed an acrobatic feat somewhere in the vicinity of her throat. 4 o'clock is hardly afternoon, Delia. It's practically evening. So the Duke prefers twilight to noon. Perhaps he's romantic. Perhaps he's poetic. Perhaps, Cordelia leaned forward conspiratorially, he simply wants to see you in that golden light that makes your hair look like autumn fire. It was a lovely thought, but Rosalind found herself remembering other details from the previous evening. The way Lucian had arrived late to the ball long after the sun had set. The way he had stood in the shadows near the refreshment table rather than in the brilliant light of the chandeliers. The way his hand, when it had touched her bare skin, had felt like winter marble rather than living flesh. "There is a darkness in him. I think I shall wear the green muslin," Rosalind said, pushing the thoughts away with the firmness of someone who has learned that dwelling on mysteries only makes them grow. "The one with the cream-colored lace at the sleeves," Cordelia clapped her hands together. "Perfect. It brings out your eyes." And Rox, her sister's voice softened. "Try to enjoy this. You deserve happiness. You deserve to be courted by a handsome duke who looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." Did he look at her that when Rosalind thought about those gray eyes steady and deep as winter seas? About the way he had watched her across the ballroom with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing her features? About the way he had said he had waited so long, as if 5 years were an eternity rather than a handful of seasons? Yes, she decided. He did look at her that way. And that perhaps was the most terrifying thing of all. Because Rosalind Hartwell had learned not to trust happiness, had learned that hope was a luxury that women like her could not afford. And yet here it was blooming stubborn and wild in the garden of her chest, refusing to be uprooted by doubt or fear or anonymous warnings. 4 o'clock, she thought. Just a few hours. Just enough time to prepare herself for whatever came next. She did not know, could not have known, that the man who would arrive at her door in precisely 6 hours had already been awake for 3 of them. That Duke Lucian Ashcroft had paced his study in the pre-dawn gloom, arguing with himself about wisdom and folly, and the particular madness of wanting something he had no right to want. That he had stood before the portrait of Lady Arabella Fairfax that hung in his private chambers, looking into painted eyes that had once looked at him with love before they looked at him with horror, and asked her forgiveness for what he was about to do. That he had made a decision that was either the bravest or the most selfish act of his very long life. He was going to court Lady Rosalind Hartwell properly. And if she discovered what he was, if she looked at him with the same terror that Arabella had shown in her final moments, then he would accept that punishment as his due. But he could not let her slip away without at least trying to reach for something real. Something that made his immortal existence feel less like a curse and more like a gift. Even if that gift was destined to be brief. Lucian arrived at Hartwell House at precisely 4 o'clock when the afternoon sun had mellowed into something he could tolerate with sufficient layers of clothing and strategic positioning in shaded areas. His driver, another servant who knew the truth of his master's nature, had timed the route to minimize exposure, and Lucian descended from the carriage wearing a hat with a broad brim and gloves that covered every inch of skin. To society, he was a man with an unfortunate sensitivity to light, a medical condition tragic but manageable. They did not know, could never know, that direct sunlight would eventually turn his flesh to ash, that he existed in a perpetual twilight, neither fully alive nor completely dead, that he was something other pretending to be a man. The butler who answered the door was clearly flustered by the presence of a duke on the doorstep. He stammered through the appropriate courtesies and led Lucian to the garden, where a small table had been set with tea things and delicate pastries that Lucian would not touch. And there she was. Lady Rosalind stood near the rose bushes, the lowering sun painting her in shades of amber and rose. She wore a gown of pale green that made her auburn hair seem to catch fire. And when she turned at his approach, the smile that lit her face was so genuine, so unguarded, that Lucian felt something twist painfully in the region where his heart had once beat. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that was both proper and somehow warm. "Welcome to our home. I'm afraid it's rather modest compared to what you're accustomed to." "It's perfect," Lucian replied, and meant it, because she was in it, and that made even the smallest cottage into a palace. "Thank you for receiving me." They settled at the table, and Cordelia appeared briefly to serve as chaperone before making herself scarce with a discretion that suggested she understood the value of giving her sister space. Rosalind poured tea with practiced grace, and Lucian accepted a cup he would not drink, cradling it for warmth and the appearance of normalcy. "I must confess," Rosalind said, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that did not quite hide their trembling. "I am still somewhat shocked by last night. Your attention was unexpected." "Was it?" Lucian asked gently. "I find that surprising. Surely you must know how remarkable you are." Color rose in her cheeks, and she looked down at her own teacup. "Remarkable women do not usually find themselves exiled from society for 5 years, Your Grace. Then society is populated by fools who cannot recognize virtue when it stands before them in a blue silk gown." She looked up at that surprise clear in her green eyes. "You seem very certain of my virtue, considering we met only last evening." This was the moment, the first small stone in the foundation he was trying to build. Lucian set down his teacup and met her gaze directly. "Lady Rosalind, I am going to tell you something that may seem strange. I was at the Blackwood estate 5 years ago. I was not a guest at the house party, but I was nearby, and I saw what happened in the garden that night." The blood drained from her face. "You were there. I saw you try to save that young woman. I saw Lord Ravenscroft's violence and your courage. I saw the lies that followed." Lucian leaned forward, his voice dropping to something fierce and gentle at once. "I have known the truth about you from the beginning, Rosalind. I know you are innocent. I know you are brave. And I have spent 5 years watching you bear undeserved shame with a grace that humbles me." "Watching me," she whispered, and there was something in her voice he could not quite identify. Not fear precisely, but awareness, caution. "For 5 years. I know how that sounds," Lucian said quickly. "I know it must seem inappropriate, perhaps even frightening. But I assure you my interest has been purely protective. I wanted to ensure you were safe, that you had what you needed. I could not intervene publicly without revealing how I knew the truth without making things worse for you. But I could watch. I could make certain that you were not entirely alone." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with an intensity that made him wonder what she saw there, what she suspected. Finally she spoke. "Why did you not come forward? Why did you not tell someone what you saw?" "Because I am a creature of the night who cannot risk scrutiny. Because vampire law forbids interference in human affairs without cause. Because the last time I tried to save someone, she died. Because I am a coward," Lucian said instead, and it was not entirely a lie. "Because I was not certain my word would matter against Lord Ravenscroft's. Because I have learned over time that truth is not always sufficient to overcome prejudice." "Over time," Rosalind repeated softly. "You speak as though you've lived a very long time, Your Grace, but you cannot be much older than I am." The observation was keen, too keen. Lucian felt the first stirrings of the familiar panic that came whenever someone looked at him too closely, noticed the small inconsistencies that marked him as other. "I am 34, he said, which was true in terms of his appearance. "But I have always felt older than my years. Perhaps that is what isolation does. It ages the soul, if not the flesh." "Yes," Rosalind said quietly, "I understand that. These 5 years have felt like 50 sometimes." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Lucian marveled at how easy it was to be near her, how her presence seemed to quiet the constant restlessness that plagued him, how for the first time in decades he felt almost peaceful. "May I ask you something?" Rosalind said finally. "Anything." "The letter I received last night. The warning about you, about hidden troubles. She watched his face carefully. Is there truth in it? Lucian's hands tightened on the teacup. Yes, he said simply. There are complications in my life, Rosalind. More than you can possibly imagine. But I promise you this, I would never ever cause you harm. Whatever challenges I carry, I have learned to control them, to live with them, to ensure they touch no one else. What kind of complications, she pressed, and there was no judgment in her voice. Only curiosity. Only the same courage she had shown in that garden 5 years ago. The kind that cannot be shared in a single afternoon, Lucian replied carefully. The kind that requires trust and time and perhaps a faith that I have no right to ask for. But Rosalind, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I will never deceive you. If you ask me a question directly, I will answer it truthfully, even if that truth drives you away from me. She absorbed this in silence, her green eyes searching his face for signs of deception or danger. And Lucian waited, hardly breathing, for her verdict. Then I will not ask, she said finally. Not yet, not until I am ready to hear the answer. But your grace, when I do ask, I will expect that truth you promise. Relief and trepidation warred in his chest. You have my word. The courtship that followed was unlike anything London society had seen in recent memory. Duke Lucian Ashcroft, the reclusive master of one of England's greatest fortunes, courted the scandalous Lady Rosalind with a devotion that was both proper and unmistakably passionate. He called every day at 4 o'clock when the sun was low enough for him to bear. They took drives through Hyde Park in the golden hours before sunset, the matched grays of his curricle turning heads as they passed. He escorted her to evening musical performances and dinner parties, always at her side and always making it clear through his every action that she was worthy of the highest respect. And slowly, grudgingly, society began to shift its opinion. If the Duke of Ashcroft finds her acceptable, Lady Pemberton was heard to remark, then perhaps we have been too hasty in our judgments. He is clearly not a man who makes frivolous choices. Lord Thornton agreed. If he sees worth in Lady Rosalind, then worth there must be. It was mercenary, this sudden acceptance, based not on Rosalind's actual innocence, but on Lucian's endorsement. But Rosalind found she did not care about their reasons. She cared only that the whispers were finally changing their tune, that she could enter a room without feeling the weight of shame pressing down on her shoulders, that she could, for the first time in 5 years, imagine a future that included more than quiet charity work and sisterly devotion. But even as her social position improved, Rosalind found herself noticing things. Small things, troubling things. Lucian never ate in her presence. Oh, he accepted plates of food at dinner parties, pushed delicacies around with his fork, raised glasses to his lips. But she never actually saw him consume anything, beyond perhaps a sip of wine so dark it looked like blood in the candlelight. He never called before 4 o'clock, never appeared at daytime events, never once suggested a morning drive or afternoon garden party. Always evening, always twilight, always shadow. And then there was the portrait. 3 weeks into their courtship, Lucian invited her and Cordelia to dine at Ashcroft Manor. The estate was magnificent, all Gothic spires and ancient stone, the kind of place that looked like it had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Inside, the halls were lined with portraits of Ashcroft ancestors going back centuries. Rosalind had been admiring them with genuine interest when she stopped before one that made her breath catch in her throat. It was labeled as being from 1776, 50 years ago. And the man in the portrait, wearing the fashion of that earlier era, looked exactly like Lucian. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. The same strong jaw, the same gray eyes, the same slight curl to the dark hair. An ancestor, Cordelia said beside her. The resemblance is quite remarkable, isn't it? Yes, Rosalind whispered. Remarkable. But that night, lying in her bed at home, she could not stop thinking about that portrait, about the impossibility of such perfect resemblance across 50 years, about all the small oddities she had been cataloging like a naturalist collecting specimens, about the coolness of his skin when they had touched, about the way he seemed to avoid mirrors, turning away whenever they passed one in a hallway or room, about the fact that she had never not once seen him during daylight hours, about the warning letter that had spoken of hidden troubles beyond normal understanding. She rose from her bed and went to her bookshelf, pulling down a volume she had purchased weeks ago on a whim she had not fully understood at the time. A collection of folklore and legends, the kind of book that respectable young ladies were not supposed to find fascinating. She turned to the section on creatures of the night, on beings that existed between life and death, on those who wore human faces and lived on stolen blood, on vampires, The descriptions matched too well to be coincidence. The avoidance of sunlight, the agelessness, the unnatural coolness of flesh, the lack of reflection, the need to feed on blood disguised as a preference for rare meat and dark wine. Rosalind sat on her bed with the book open in her lap and felt her world tilt on its axis. It was impossible. Vampires were stories, Gothic tales to frighten children and entertain adults with a taste for the macabre. They did not exist in the real world of London society and calling cards and proper courtship. Except what if they did? What if the impossible was simply the truth that had not yet been proven? What if the man she was falling in love with was exactly what the evidence suggested? What if Duke Lucian Ashcroft was a vampire? The question once formed could not be unformed. It sat in her mind like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples outward to touch every memory, every observation, every moment they had shared. She should have been terrified, should have fled to Cordelia's room and insisted they leave London immediately, should have done what Arabella, according to the legend the book recounted, had done when she discovered the truth about her immortal lover. But Rosalind found to her great surprise that she was not afraid. Curious, yes. Unsettled, certainly. But not afraid. Because vampire or not, the man who had courted her these past weeks had shown her only kindness, had treated her with a respect she had not known in 5 years, had looked at her as if she were precious rather than damaged, had made her feel alive again. You're being ridiculous, she told herself firmly, closing the book and returning it to the shelf. You're letting Gothic novels and anonymous letters turn courtship into fantasy. The Duke is simply a man with unusual habits and an unfortunate sensitivity to light. That is all. But even as she climbed back into bed and willed herself to sleep, a part of her knew she was lying. And another part, the part that had saved Maris in the garden 5 years ago, the part that had endured exile with dignity, the part that was braver than she usually gave herself credit for, began to plan. If Lucian was what she suspected, then she needed to know, needed to hear it from him directly, needed to understand what she was dealing with before her heart became any more entangled than it already was. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would find a way to ask him directly, and he would answer truthfully as he had promised, even if that truth changed everything. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next evening, Lucian arrived for their customary drive through Hyde Park, but the weather had turned cold and threatening, with heavy clouds promising rain. Instead of the open curricle, he suggested they walk in the gardens at Ashcroft Manor, where paths were covered and they could talk in privacy without the constraints of public scrutiny. Cordelia, bless her romantic heart, had developed a sudden headache and insisted Rosalind go without her, winking outrageously when Lucian was not looking. So it was that Rosalind found herself alone with the Duke in the twilight gardens of his estate, surrounded by ancient roses and shadowed pathways that seemed designed for secrets. They walked in companionable silence for a while, and Rosalind gathered her courage like a cloak around her shoulders. Finally, as they reached a secluded arbor, where a bench sat beneath trailing wisteria, she stopped and turned to face him. "Lucien," she said, using his given name for the first time, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to remember your promise to answer me truthfully." His expression grew guarded, but he nodded. "Of course, ask me anything. Why can you not bear the sunlight?" A muscle in his jaw tightened. "I told you, I have a medical condition." "Please," Rosalind interrupted gently, "please don't insult my intelligence. I have noticed things, Lucian. Many things. The portrait from 1776, your refusal to eat, the coldness of your skin, the way you avoid mirrors." She took a breath. "I have done research. I have read things, and I need to know if my suspicions are correct." Lucian stood very still, and in the fading light, he looked like a statue carved from marble, beautiful and remote and utterly inhuman. "What suspicions?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Are you a vampire?" The question fell into the space between them like a stone into deep water. For a long moment, Lucian did not move, did not speak, did not even appear to breathe. Then slowly he sank onto the bench, as if his legs would no longer support him. "Yes," he said simply, "I am a vampire. I have been a vampire since the year 1646. I am not 34 years old. I am 180, and I am something other who has been lying to you by omission since the moment we met." Rosalind's legs felt suddenly weak, and she sat beside him on the bench, her mind racing. One part of her had suspected, had been preparing for this confirmation. But hearing it spoken aloud in his voice with such weary honesty made it real in a way that research and speculation never could. "Tell me," she said quietly, "tell me everything." And so in that twilight garden, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Lucian told her. He told her about his life before, about being the Duke of Ashcroft in an earlier age, about the vampire who had attacked him and turned him against his will, about waking to a new existence where sunlight meant death and blood meant survival, about learning to control the hunger to pass as human, to exist in the shadows of the world. He told her about the covenant, the vampire laws that govern their kind, about how they lived among humans in secret, taking blood only from the willing or from those who would not be missed, maintaining the fragile balance between their two worlds. And he told her about Arabella. She was the daughter of a duke. Lucian said, his voice raw with old pain. This was 50 years ago. I had managed my condition for over a century by then. I thought I had mastered it, thought I could allow myself to care for someone without endangering them. What happened? Rosalind asked softly. I fell in love with her, and she with me. I courted her properly, intending to marry her, intending to tell her the truth once we were wed and bound together. But she discovered it before I could confess. Found me in my chambers one night when I was feeding. She saw my true nature, and she was terrified. Lucian's hands clenched into fists on his knees. She ran from me, fled through the manor in a panic. I tried to follow, tried to explain, but that only frightened her more. She took a carriage, told the driver to take her anywhere away from me. The carriage overturned on the road. She died from her injuries within hours, and it was my fault. My existence, my nature, my inability to control my need, it killed her. Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. That was not your fault, Lucian. That was an accident. An accident caused by what I am, he insisted. Don't you see, Rosalind? This is why I should never have approached you. Why I should have stayed in the shadows where I belong. Because I am cursed, and everyone I love dies. And now you know the truth, and you will run from me as Arabella did, and I will lose you too, and it will be exactly what I deserve. He stood abruptly as if to leave, to spare her the burden of rejecting him. But Rosalind stood too and caught his arm, feeling the coolness of him even through the fabric of his coat. I am not running, she said firmly. Lucian stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue. You should be. Rosalind, I survive by drinking blood. I cannot go into sunlight. I will live forever while everyone around me ages and dies. I am something other than human. You are a man who has lived with an impossible burden for 180 years, Rosalind corrected. A man who has maintained his humanity despite every reason to lose it. A man who has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. A man who has given me back my place in the world. You cannot possibly accept this, Lucian protested, but there was desperate hope in his eyes now. You cannot possibly want... I have lived for 5 years as a ghost in society, Rosalind interrupted, stepping closer onto him. I have been treated as something less than human because of a lie. I have been judged and condemned and cast aside. Do you truly think I am in a position to judge you for being different, for carrying burdens that you did not choose? It's not the same, isn't it? She reached up to touch his face, feeling the coolness of his skin, the absence of a pulse in his throat, and finding that none of it frightened her. You say you are cursed, but I have seen true cruelty, Lucian. I have seen Lord Ravencroft assault a helpless girl. I have seen society destroy an innocent woman for sport. I have seen cruelty in the hearts of living, breathing humans. And I tell you truly, you are not cursed. You are simply a man carrying an extraordinary burden. Rosalind, he breathed, and his hands came up to cradle her face with a gentleness that belied his supernatural strength. You cannot possibly mean this. When you have had time to think, to truly consider what I am, I have considered, she said softly. And my conclusion is this: I would rather have twilight with you than a full day with anyone else. For a moment, Lucian simply stared at her, his gray eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. Then very slowly he leaned down and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses of courtship. It was desperate and tender, and full of the longing of nearly 2 centuries of isolation. His lips were cool against hers, but they warmed as the kiss deepened, and Rosalind felt something shift in her chest, something that felt like recognition, like coming home. When they finally parted, both breathing hard despite the fact that Lucian did not technically need to breathe, he rested his forehead against hers. You are extraordinary, he murmured, and I do not deserve you. But I swear, Rosalind Hartwell, I will spend whatever time we have together trying to be worthy of this gift you have given me. And what gift is that? She asked, smiling despite the tears on her cheeks. Acceptance, he said simply. Faith, a second chance to love without fear. They stood together in the garden as the rain fell around them, as the twilight deepened into true night, as the impossible became possible. And the cursed found redemption in the arms of someone brave enough to see past the surface to the truth beneath. But their moment of peace was not destined to last long. The shift in their relationship was subtle but unmistakable. Lucian courted Rosalind with renewed intensity, and she met his devotion with a calm acceptance that spoke of understanding rather than ignorance. To society, they appeared to be a couple, falling naturally and appropriately in love. But between themselves, they spoke in the language of those who had looked into shadows and chosen light anyway. They still had obstacles to overcome. Chief among them was the Dowager Duchess, Genevieve Lucian's mother, who arrived at Ashcroft Manor 1 week after Rosalind's discovery with the stated intention of assessing this young woman who has captured my son's attention. The dinner was formal and tense. Genevieve sat at the head of the table, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style, her dark eyes sharp as she studied Rosalind across the gleaming surface. "So, Lady Rosalind," she said as the first course was served, "my son tells me you have overcome significant adversity in your young life." "I have been fortunate to survive scandal with my character intact, Your Grace," Rosalind replied carefully. "Have you indeed?" Genevieve's smile was thin. "And now you have set your sights on a duke. How convenient." The implication was clear and cutting. Rosalind felt color rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Lucian set down his fork with enough force to make the china rattle. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "you will treat Lady Rosalind with the respect she deserves, or you will leave my house." Genevieve's eyebrows rose. My. The boy has teeth. How unlike you, Lucian. You are usually so careful about maintaining civility." "I am careful about many things," Lucian replied evenly. "But I will not be careful about this. Rosalind is important to me, more important than propriety or politics or anything else, and she will be treated accordingly." Something shifted in Genevieve's expression. She studied her son for a long moment, then turned her attention back to Rosalind with new intensity. "Tell me, my dear, what do you know of my son's particular circumstances?" The question was loaded with meaning. Rosalind met the dowager's gaze steadily. "I know that he carries burdens he did not choose. I know that he has maintained his honor despite impossible challenges. And I know that he is the finest man I have ever known, regardless of any circumstances that might make him different." "Different," Genevieve repeated softly. "What a diplomatic word. And you are not frightened by this difference." "I have learned that fear of the different often says more about the person feeling fear than about the subject of it," Rosalind replied. "No, Your Grace, I am not frightened. I am honored that he trusts me with his truth." Genevieve was silent for a long moment. Then, to both Lucian's and Rosalind's surprise, she smiled. A real smile, this time warm and genuine. "You'll do," she said simply. "You'll do very well indeed. Welcome to the family, my dear, though I suspect you have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Later, when the dinner had concluded and Genevieve had retired to her chambers, Lucian explained that his mother was also a vampire, that he had turned her himself a century ago to save her from a wasting illness that would have killed her within weeks. "So you see," he said, standing with Rosalind in the moonlit garden, "you would not just be marrying me, you would be joining a family of immortals, taking on a legacy of secrecy and shadow. Are you certain this is what you want?" Rosalind thought about her charity work at the founding hospital, about the children she had been helping, about how Lucian had begun joining her on her evening visits, how gently he spoke to the orphans, how generous he was with his wealth in ensuring they had good futures. "I want a life with meaning," she said. "I want to use whatever position I have to help those who need help. I want to love and be loved in return. Whether that happens in daylight or twilight seems rather beside the point." "You are either the bravest woman alive," Lucian murmured, "or the most foolish." "Perhaps both," Rosalind agreed. "But Lucian, I have spent 5 years being defined by other people's judgments. I refuse to let fear dictate my choices anymore. I choose you. I choose this. Whatever consequences come, we will face them together." He kissed her then, and in that kiss was every promise he could not speak aloud, that he would protect her, that he would cherish her, that he would spend eternity trying to be worthy of her faith. But eternity, as they would soon discover, was a complicated concept when mortal enemies wore familiar faces. Lord Philip Ravencroft had been watching the courtship between the Duke and Lady Rosalind with growing alarm. He had created that scandal 5 years ago with such careful planning, had destroyed her reputation so thoroughly that she should have been untouchable forever. And now this vampire duke was undoing all his work, was making her respectable again, was threatening to expose the truth about that night in the garden. Ravencroft could not allow it, because he was not simply a cruel aristocrat who had gotten away with assault. He was something more, something that came from a long line of something more. His family had been hunting vampires for 300 years, had tracked them, studied them, learned their weaknesses. And the Duke of Ashcroft had been on their list for over a century. Elusive, careful, impossible to prove or expose. Until now, because vampires, for all their power and immortality, had one fatal weakness. They loved. And when they loved, they became reckless. They exposed themselves to save those they cared for. And Ravencroft intended to use that weakness to finally destroy Lucian Ashcroft. He sent the letter to the Duke's residence on a cold morning when society was buzzing about the impending engagement announcement. Simple, direct, devastating. Your Grace, your courtship of Lady Rosalind has been noted with interest. It would be a shame if certain truths about your nature became public knowledge. Perhaps we should discuss this matter face to face. I propose we meet at the Thornton estate tomorrow at noon on the terrace where we can talk in broad daylight. Unless, of course, you have some reason to avoid such a meeting, in which case I would be forced to conclude that the rumors about you are true, and to share those conclusions with society. Your servant, Lord Philip Ravencroft. When Lucian read the letter, his hands trembled with rage and fear. Ravencroft knew the hunter had finally found his proof, and now he was demanding Lucian appear in full daylight or be exposed for what he was. It was an impossible choice, appear and die, refuse and be revealed. Either way, he lost Rosalind. Either way, the brief happiness he had found would be destroyed. No, Rosalind said fiercely when he showed her the letter that evening. No, you will not sacrifice yourself. There must be another way. There is no other way, Lucian said heavily. If I appear at noon, the sunlight will destroy me within minutes. If I refuse, Ravencroft will expose me, and society will hunt me down. Either choice ends the same way. Then we leave, Rosalind insisted. We go somewhere he cannot follow, somewhere we can be together without fear, and spend our lives running. Lucian shook his head. That is no life for you, my love. You deserve better than hiding in shadows. You keep saying what I deserve. Rosalind's voice broke on the words. But what I deserve is you. What I want is a future with you, and I am not giving up without a fight. They sat together in the growing twilight, hands clasped, facing an impossible future. Tomorrow noon, Lucian would have to make a choice, and whatever he chose would change everything. But Rosalind Hartwell had not survived 5 years of scandal by accepting defeat easily, and she had not discovered the truth about the man she loved, only to lose him to a hunter's trap. Somewhere in the tangled web of this situation, there had to be a thread she could pull, a weakness she could exploit, a truth that would free them both. She just had to find it before noon tomorrow, before the sun rose high and bright and destroyed the only chance at happiness she had known in 5 long years. The clock was ticking, and the shadows were closing in. The night before Lord Ravencroft's ultimatum, Rosalind could not sleep. She paced her chamber like a caged thing, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding each one as quickly as it formed. Every solution led back to the same impossible conclusion. Lucian would have to choose between death and exposure, and either choice would destroy them both, unless she could find another way. The idea came to her as dawn was breaking, painting her window in shades of rose and gold that Lucian would never see. It was dangerous. It was perhaps foolish, but it was the only chance they had. She dressed quickly and sent for Cordelia, who appeared bleary-eyed and concerned. I need you to find someone, Rosalind said without preamble. The maid from the Blackwood estate, Maris. She married a footman from the household, I believe. She may have children now. Find her, Delia. Find her and bring her to me before noon today. Cordelia's eyes widened with understanding. You're going to make her tell the truth after 5 years. I'm going to give her the chance to make things right, Rosalind corrected, and I'm going to use that truth to destroy the man who has been destroying lives for far too long. While Cordelia set off on her mission, Rosalind penned 2 letters. The first went to Dowager Duchess Genevieve requesting an immediate audience on a matter of utmost urgency. The second went to every prominent member of society she could think of, inviting them to a gathering at Ashcroft Manor at 11 o'clock that morning. An announcement of great importance, she wrote. Attendance strongly encouraged. Then she went to see Lucian. She found him in his study, standing before the window that faced east, watching the sunrise he could never touch. He looked as though he had not slept, either his dark hair disheveled, his evening clothes rumpled. When he heard her enter, he did not turn. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "It's improper for you to visit me unchaperoned at this hour." "I think we are well past concerns about propriety," Rosalind replied, crossing the room to stand beside him. "Lucian, I have a plan. There is no plan that ends with both of us happy, my love." "Then we shall have to prove the impossible possible," she said firmly. "Trust me, please. Just trust me for a few more hours." He turned to look at her, then his gray eyes haunted but also full of a desperate hope he was trying not to show. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to do what you did for me," Rosalind said softly. "I am going to stand in the light and dare the world to look away." Dowager Duchess Genevieve arrived at Ashcroft Manor at 9 o'clock, her expression unreadable, as she was shown into the morning room where Rosalind waited. The older woman settled into a chair with the grace of someone who had been navigating society's complexities for far longer than her apparent age suggested. "This had better be worth dragging me from my bed at such an ungodly hour," Genevieve said, though there was no real bite to her words. "What is so urgent, child?" "Lord Ravencroft is a vampire hunter," Rosalind said without preamble. "He knows what Lucian is, and he has trapped him. Lucian must either appear in full sunlight at noon today or be exposed as a vampire to all of society." Genevieve's face went very still. "How long have you known about vampire hunters?" "I didn't until last night when I couldn't sleep and started researching the Ravencroft family history in Lucian's library." Rosalind pulled out a leather-bound journal she had found in the early hours. This belonged to Ravencroft's grandfather. It documents 3 generations of vampire hunting, and there's an entry from 30 years ago about approaching a young vampire duke and offering to help him become a daywalker in exchange for certain favors. "Lucian refused," Genevieve said quietly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He always refused to compromise his principles even when it would have made his existence easier. And Ravencroft has hated him ever since," Rosalind confirmed. "But here's what I don't understand. The journal mentions something called the Twilight Curse. A vampire bound by true love can walk in diffused light, sunrise, sunset, heavy cloud cover. Have you ever heard of this?" Genevieve was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "It's an old legend. Most vampires dismiss it as fairy tale. The idea that love could weaken the curse enough to allow even limited daylight exposure seems improbable, but not impossible. Nothing is impossible when it comes to matters of the heart," Genevieve said. "But Rosalind, even if this legend is true, even if Lucian's love for you has granted him some protection, we're talking about full noon sun. That would destroy even an elder vampire like myself. There is no love strong enough to overcome that." "Then we don't let him face noon sun alone," Rosalind said. "We end this before the clock strikes 12. We expose Ravencroft for what he truly is, and we do it in front of all of society." "And how do you propose we do that?" Rosalind smiled, and there was something fierce in her expression that reminded Genevieve of herself in younger years. "By telling the truth, all of it, starting with what really happened in that garden 5 years ago." By 11 o'clock, Ashcroft Manor's grand ballroom was filled with the most influential members of London society. They had come out of curiosity drawn by the mysterious summons and the promise of an important announcement. Lady Pemberton was there, Lord Thornton, the Whitmore family, even Lady Remington, whose ball had started this entire chain of events. And standing at the back of the room wearing an expression of barely concealed triumph was Lord Philip Ravencroft. Rosalind stood at the front of the room, Lucian beside her, his hand warm in hers despite the coolness that usually defined him. Genevieve stood on his other side, a united front of the Ashcroft family. And in the corner, partially hidden by a screen, Cordelia waited with a woman who had not been seen in London society for 5 years. Maris, the maid from the Blackwood estate, now respectably married and mother of 3, had agreed to come. Had agreed to finally speak the truth she had been too frightened to voice when it mattered most. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rosalind began, her voice carrying across the crowded room with a strength born of 5 years of silent suffering. "Thank you for coming. I know this is highly irregular, but I have asked you here today to bear witness to the truth about events that occurred 5 years ago at the Blackwood estate." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ravencroft's smile widened. "5 years ago, I was branded with scandal," Rosalind continued, "accused of inappropriate behavior with Lord Ravencroft. My reputation was destroyed. My life as I knew it ended, and I accepted that judgment because I believed that no one would listen to a 17-year-old girl's word against a lord's." "My dear Lady Rosalind," Ravencroft said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, Is this really necessary? Must you drag up an old scandals, particularly when you have finally managed to overcome them through the Duke's generous attention? I must, Rosalind said firmly, because the scandal was based on a lie, and the truth matters even when it comes 5 years too late. She gestured to the screen, and Cordelia led Maris forward. The woman was trembling, her eyes downcast, but when she looked up and saw Rosalind's encouraging smile, she found her courage. My name is Maris Fletcher, formerly in service at the Blackwood Estate, she said, her voice shaking but clear. And 5 years ago, Lord Ravencroft assaulted me in the garden. He had me pinned against a wall and I could not fight him off. I would have been ruined, perhaps killed, if Lady Rosalind had not found us and struck him with a branch to make him release me. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Ravencroft's face went white, then red. This is preposterous, he sputtered. The word of a servant against a lord, and conveniently produced after 5 years. The word of a respectable married woman, Lucian said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, who has lived with guilt for 5 years because she was too frightened to speak the truth. A woman who has nothing to gain from this testimony except peace of conscience. I was terrified. Maris continued, tears streaming down her face now. Lord Ravencroft threatened to ruin me if I spoke, to ensure I could never find work again. And I was weak, and I said nothing, and I have regretted it every day since. But I will not be silent anymore. Lady Rosalind saved me. She sacrificed her own reputation to protect me, and the least I can do is give her back her good name. Beautiful performance, Ravencroft sneered, but hardly proof of anything. It's her word against mine, just as it was 5 years ago. And we all know how that ended. Not quite, Genevieve said smoothly, producing a document from her reticule. You see, Lord Ravencroft, you were not as careful as you thought. There were 3 other maids at the Blackwood estate who reported inappropriate advances from you. They were dismissed without reference, of course, and scattered to different households. But I have spent the past week tracking them down and gathering their sworn statements. Would you like me to read them aloud? Ravencroft's face was now the color of old parchment. Around the room, expressions were shifting from skepticism to disgust. This is outrageous, he hissed. You cannot possibly— Cannot what? Lucian said softly, stepping forward. Cannot expose you as a predator who has been preying on vulnerable women for years. Cannot reveal that your accusation against Rosalind 5 years ago was designed to cover your own crimes. Cannot show society exactly what kind of man you truly are. You have no right to judge me, Ravencroft spat, and now his careful facade was crumbling entirely. You who are not even human. You who hide your true nature behind title and wealth. You think I don't know what you are, Ashcroft. You think I haven't been watching you for years. The room fell silent. Lucian's hand tightened on Rosalind's. What are you talking about? Lord Thornton asked, confusion evident in his voice. Ravencroft laughed, wild and bitter. Oh, this is rich. You want to expose me, then let me expose you. Duke Lucian Ashcroft is a vampire, a creature of the night, one who feeds on blood and cannot bear sunlight. That is why he only appears at evening events, why he never eats, why he has not aged a day since the portrait painted 50 years ago that hangs in his hall. Gasps echoed through the room. Several ladies clutched their pearls. Lord Pemberton looked ready to faint, and Lucian stood perfectly still, his face expressionless, waiting for the verdict that would determine his fate. Is this true? Lady Thornton asked, her voice shaking. Your Grace, are you truly a vampire? Lucian looked at Rosalind. She nodded encouragement, and he turned to face society with the truth he had hidden for nearly 2 centuries. Yes, he said simply, I am a vampire. I was turned against my will in 1646. I have lived ever since in shadow, maintaining my humanity through careful discipline and adherence to a code that forbids me from harming the innocent. I take blood only from the willing or from sources that cause no suffering. And I have spent nearly 200 years trying to do good in a world that would destroy me if it knew what I was. You see, Ravencroft crowed triumphantly, he admits it. He is something other than human. He is a man, Rosalind said loudly, moving to stand directly in front of Lucian, who has shown me more kindness, more respect, more genuine care than any so-called gentleman in this room. He is a man who has used his considerable resources to help the poor, the sick, the forgotten. He is a man who has maintained his honor and his humanity despite carrying an impossible burden for nearly 2 centuries. She turned to face the assembled crowd, her green eyes blazing with conviction. You want to call him cursed? Then what do you call yourselves? You who destroyed a 17-year-old girl's reputation based on lies. You who whispered and gossiped and judged without ever asking for the truth. You who turned your backs on someone who needed help because it was easier than questioning your own prejudices. Her voice softened, but it lost none of its power. I have spent 5 years living with your judgment. 5 years believing I was worthless because you told me I was. And in all that time, not one of you showed me the compassion, the understanding, the simple human decency that this vampire has shown me from the moment we met. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that were now filled with shame. So yes, Duke Ashcroft is a vampire, and I love him. I love him for his courage, his integrity, his kindness, and his strength. I love him because he sees me as I truly am, rather than what scandal has painted me to be. And if that makes me foolish or reckless or damned, then so be it. I would rather spend one day loved by a vampire than a lifetime accepted by people who have no idea what true honor means. The silence that followed was absolute. And then from the back of the room, someone began to clap. It was Lord Whitmore, young and idealistic and brave enough to follow his conscience. "Well said, Lady Rosalind," he called out. "Well said indeed." Another joined him, then another, and soon impossibly the room was filled with applause. "This is madness," Ravencroft shouted. "You cannot possibly accept this. He is a vampire, a creature of night. He is a duke who has never harmed anyone," Lady Pemberton said firmly, "who has by all accounts been a model of propriety and generosity. Whereas you, Lord Ravencroft, stand accused by multiple witnesses of assault and predatory behavior. I know which of you I find more disturbing." "Agreed," Lord Thornton added. "Your Grace, I apologize for any prejudice I may have shown. Lady Rosalind is correct. You have proven your character through your actions. What you are matters far less than who you are." Ravencroft looked around wildly, seeing his victory crumbling into defeat. "You are all fools," he hissed. "You would embrace something unnatural while condemning me for trying to expose him. My family has hunted vampires for 3 centuries. We protect humanity from creatures like him." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Genevieve asked coldly. "Or is the truth something else? My son rejected your grandfather's offer to turn him into a vampire 30 years ago. Rejected it because he saw the corruption in your family's heart. And you have hated him ever since, haven't you? This was never about protecting anyone. This was about revenge." "You don't understand," Ravencroft said, and now there was desperation in his voice. "He could have given us the gift of immortality, could have made us powerful. But he refused, and we have suffered for it. So yes, I wanted to destroy him. I wanted him to feel the pain of losing everything he valued, just as my family has lost everything we desired." "Then you have failed," Lucian said quietly, "because I have not lost anything. I have gained more than I ever dreamed possible. I have found love, I have found acceptance, and I have found proof that humanity, true humanity, has nothing to do with immortality. It has only to do with the choices we make and the way we treat those who are different from ourselves." He turned to Ravencroft with something almost like pity in his eyes. "I am sorry your family's obsession consumed them. I am sorry my refusal to compromise my principles felt like rejection. But I will not apologize for what I am or for choosing love over fear. And I will not allow you to destroy the happiness I have finally found." "Guards," Lord Thornton called out, for he had brought men with him, sensing there might be trouble. "Please escort Lord Ravencroft from the premises, and someone send for the magistrate. I believe there are several charges of assault that need to be formally investigated." As Ravencroft was led away, still protesting, still threatening, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to something approaching celebration. People crowded around Lucian and Rosalind, offering congratulations, apologies, and acceptance. But Rosalind barely heard them, because she was looking at the windows, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, watching the light grow brighter and more dangerous. It was nearly noon. "We need to get you somewhere protected," Rosalind said urgently, pulling Lucian toward the interior of the manor. "The sun is getting too strong." "Wait," Genevieve said, catching her son's arm. "Lucian, do you feel anything unusual? Any change in your tolerance?" Lucian paused, and Rosalind saw him testing his awareness of the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. His brow furrowed in concentration. "It doesn't hurt," he said slowly, wonderingly. "It should hurt by now. The light should be burning, but I only feel warm." "The Twilight Curse," Genevieve breathed. "It's real. Your love for Rosalind has weakened the curse's hold. Not completely, not enough for full midday sun perhaps, but enough for this." "Test it," Rosalind urged, "carefully. Please, Lucian, see if you can bear it." Slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt, Lucian extended his hand toward a beam of sunlight that streamed through the window. The assembled crowd watched in breathless silence as his pale fingers entered the light, and nothing happened. No burning, no smoke, no dissolution into ash, just a man's hand illuminated by sun looking perfectly normal. Lucian laughed, a sound of pure wonder and disbelief. "I can feel it," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "The warmth, the light. It's not destroying me. Rosalind, I can stand in the light." He stepped fully into the beam of sunlight, and Rosalind saw his face transform. After nearly 2 centuries of night, he was standing in the sun. Tears streamed down his face as he turned his hands over and back, watching the light play across his skin. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "I had forgotten how beautiful the world looks in daylight." Rosalind went to him, stepping into the light beside him, and took his hands in hers. They were warm now, truly warm. Not the borrowed warmth of proximity to humans, but the warmth of sunlight absorbed and held. "This doesn't mean the curse is broken," Genevieve warned. "Direct midday sun might still be dangerous. You may only be able to tolerate diffused light, cloudy days, early mornings, and late afternoons. But Lucian, this is extraordinary. This is more than any vampire has managed in recorded history." "It's enough," Lucian said, pulling Rosalind into his arms, heedless of their audience. "It's more than enough. I can see her in daylight. I can walk with her in gardens at noon. I can live, truly live, in ways I never dreamed possible." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, and what Rosalind saw there made her breath catch. Joy, hope, love so powerful it seemed to radiate from him like the very light he stood in. "Rosalind Hartwell," he said, and his voice carried across the ballroom, making this moment public and witnessed and binding. "You have given me everything. You have given me acceptance when I deserved judgment. You have given me love when I expected fear. You have given me light when I thought I was doomed to eternal night. And I want to spend whatever time we have, whether it's 50 years or 500, proving myself worthy of the gift you've given me." He released her hands long enough to pull a small velvet box from his pocket, and when he opened it, the room filled with gasps. Inside was a ring of extraordinary beauty, an emerald the color of Rosalind's eyes surrounded by diamonds that caught the sunlight and threw rainbows across the walls. "Will you marry me?" he asked, dropping to one knee in that beam of impossible sunlight. "Will you be my Duchess, my partner, my love for whatever forever we can build together?" Rosalind looked down at him, this immortal man kneeling before her, with hope and fear and love written across every line of his face. She thought about the 5 years of exile, about the scandal that had tried to break her, about the courage it had taken to survive. And she thought about how all of it, every moment of pain and night, had been leading her to this, to him, to this impossible love that had broken curses and changed the rules of the universe itself. "Yes," she said, and her voice rang clear as bells. "Yes, Lucian Ashcroft, I will marry you. I will love you. I will spend every day of my life, however long or short it may be, grateful that you were brave enough to step out of the shadows and dance with me." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand and her hand alone. Then he stood and kissed her, and the room erupted in applause and cheers, and the kind of joy that can only come from witnessing something truly miraculous. When they finally parted, Rosalind rested her forehead against his. "Do you have any regrets?" she whispered. "None," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Not a single one. From this day forward, I choose to live in the light. With you. Always." The wedding took place 3 months later at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a cloudy afternoon when Lucian could stand comfortably in the diffused daylight. The church was filled to capacity with society members who had become genuinely fond of the vampire duke and his courageous duchess-to-be. Rosalind walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, her auburn hair crowned with white roses. Cordelia walked beside her as maid of honor, tears of joy streaming down her face. And at the altar, Lucian waited in formal morning wear, looking more alive than he had in nearly 2 centuries. Dowager Duchess Genevieve sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and marveling at the son who had finally found happiness after so many years alone. The ceremony was traditional and beautiful, but the moment that everyone would remember came when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife. As Lucian lifted Rosalind's veil, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds and streamed through the stained glass window, painting them both in colored light. Blue and red and gold and green colors Lucian could now see and appreciate and stand within without fear. He kissed his bride as the light bathed them both, and in that moment, every person in that church understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a wedding, but a triumph. a love that had overcome scandal and curse, and every obstacle the world could throw at it. The reception at Ashcroft Manor was magnificent, but Lucian and Rosalind spent most of it in the garden walking hand in hand through the twilight that was quickly becoming their favorite time. Neither fully day nor fully night, but a beautiful in-between where both of them could exist comfortably. "What are you thinking?" Lucian asked, watching the way the fading light caught in her hair. "I'm thinking about all the people who said a ruined woman could never be happy," Rosalind replied. "About how wrong they were. About how the worst thing that ever happened to me led me to the best thing that ever could have happened. Your scandal," Lucian said thoughtfully, "and my curse. Two impossible burdens that somehow became the bridge between us. Do you think we would have found each other otherwise?" Rosalind wondered. "If I had never been ruined, if you had never been turned, I think we would have found each other in any lifetime," Lucian said firmly, "in any circumstance. Some connections transcend logic or reason. They simply are because they must be." They stood together as the stars began to emerge overhead, as the moon rose full and bright as the world settled into the peaceful twilight that had once been Lucian's prison, but was now his paradise. "I love you," he said, the words still new enough to feel like miracles on his tongue. "I love you too," Rosalind replied. "My vampire duke, my impossible love, my second chance at everything." 5 years later, the gardens at Ashcroft Manor rang with children's laughter as two small figures chased each other through the rose bushes. James, 4 years old, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, shrieked with delight as he tried to catch his younger sister Charlotte, who was 3 and already showed signs of the stubbornness that ran through both sides of her family. Rosalind watched from the terrace, one hand resting on her rounded belly, where their third child grew. Beside her, Lucian held a sheaf of papers detailing the latest work of the Ashcroft Foundation, which had helped over 300 women rebuild their lives after scandal or false accusation. "The Queen has agreed to formally recognize your work," Lucian said, showing her the royal letter. "She wants to present you with a commendation for services to vulnerable women." "Our work," Rosalind corrected automatically. "I could never have accomplished any of this without you." They had become a formidable team over the past 5 years. Rosalind brought the vision and the passion born from her own experience of injustice. Lucian brought the resources and the connections, using his considerable influence to change laws and attitudes. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both, a legacy of redemption and second chances. "Mama," James called, running up to the terrace. "Can Papa come play with us? The sun's not too bright anymore." It was true. Clouds had rolled in, creating the kind of diffused light that Lucian had learned to love. He set down his papers with a smile and allowed his son to drag him toward the garden, where Charlotte was already demanding that he play dragons with them. Cordelia emerged from the house, her own belly swollen with her first child. She had married Lord Whitmore 2 years ago, the young man who had been brave enough to applaud Rosalind's declaration of love for a vampire. They had become close friends with Lucian and Rosalind, part of a small circle of society members who valued character over convention. "They're going to exhaust him," Cordelia observed fondly, watching as Lucian roared dramatically while both children climbed over him. "He's stronger than he looks," Rosalind replied with a smile, "and he's making up for nearly 2 centuries of missing out on moments like this." The miracle of the children still amazed them both. Genevieve had told them it was impossibly rare that vampires almost never sired living children. But Rosalind's acceptance, her love, her willingness to see past the curse to the man, had somehow made the impossible possible yet again. "I received another letter from Maris today," Rosalind said, pulling it from her pocket. "She wants to volunteer with the foundation, helping other women find the courage to speak their truth." "That's wonderful," Cordelia said, "though I imagine seeing her still brings back difficult memories." "Less difficult than you'd think," Rosalind replied thoughtfully. "She made a mistake born of fear, and she's spent 5 years living with that guilt. Now she's trying to make amends. How can I judge her for that? I, of all people, understand the weight of living with shame you don't deserve." "You never deserved any of it," Cordelia said fiercely, as she had been saying for 10 years. "And look at you now, a duchess, a mother, a reformer, changing the very fabric of society. The scandalous Lady Rosalind has become one of the most respected women in England." Rosalind laughed. "Oh, I don't know about that. People still whisper about the duchess who married a vampire. But the whispers are different now. Curious rather than cruel, awed rather than appalled." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucian looked up from where he was being thoroughly defeated by a 4-year-old dragon slayer and a 3-year-old princess rescuer. His eyes found Rosalind's across the garden, And even after 5 years of marriage, the look he gave her made her heart skip a beat. Love, wonder, gratitude. I should go rescue him, Rosalind said, standing with the careful balance of someone in their 6th month of pregnancy. Before James decides that dragons should actually breathe fire, she made her way down to the garden, and Lucian gratefully accepted her intervention, settling the children with promises of stories before bed. They sat together on a bench beneath the rose arbor where he had first confessed his true nature, where she had first told him she was not afraid. Do you ever think about that night, Lucian asked, as if reading her thoughts. When you discovered what I was, when you could have run but chose to stay. All the time, Rosalind admitted. I think about how terrified I should have been, how any sensible woman would have fled. And then I think about how grateful I am that I've never been particularly sensible. Lucian laughed, and the sound was still one of her favorite things in the world. Free and genuine and full of life. What are you most grateful for? He asked. Rosalind looked around the garden at her children playing at her sister, glowing with impending motherhood at the manor that had become her home. She thought about the foundation that bore her name, about the women they had helped, about the lives that had been changed because she had been brave enough to love the impossible. I'm grateful, she said softly, that I learned my worth came from within, not from society's judgment, that I found the courage to believe in second chances, and that I was blessed enough to find you. And now, Lucian prompted, pulling her closer against his side, now I know that love really can transform curses into blessings, that the things we think will destroy us can actually be the making of us, and that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that should have been impossible. She tilted her face up to kiss him, gentle and sweet and full of the comfortable affection of two people who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. I love you, Lucian Ashcroft, my vampire duke, my impossible love, my proof that fairy tales can come true. And I love you, Rosalind Ashcroft, my brave duchess, my redemption, my reminder that humanity has everything to do with the courage to love without fear. They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, as their children played in the garden, where sunlight and shadow met in perfect balance, as the impossible life they had built together continued to unfold in all its messy, miraculous, beautiful complexity. Somewhere in London, other scandals were brewing, other women were being judged unfairly. Other outcasts were learning to navigate a world that valued appearance over truth. But they would not face those challenges alone because the Ashcroft Foundation would be there. Because Rosalind and Lucian had proven that redemption was possible, that love could conquer even the deepest curses, that second chances were not just fairy tales but real tangible possibilities. And because every person who heard their story would carry away the same message that worth is not determined by society's judgment, that love is stronger than fear, and that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that should have been impossible. The vampire and the ruined lady, the cursed duke and the scandalous miss, two broken people who found each other in the shadows and chose to walk together into the light. It was a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that true love does not erase challenges but transforms them. That redemption is not about becoming perfect, but about being brave enough to be imperfect together. And their love, impossible and transformative and true, would light the way for others walking similar paths for generations to come. The Vampire Duke and his fearless Duchess. Living proof that fairy tales were not just stories but promises waiting to be claimed by anyone brave enough to reach for them.